Edmund Burke, a figure of great historical significance, was most likely born on January 12, 1730, in Dublin, Ireland's bustling capital. However, some sources suggest that his birthplace could have been Shambley Moor in County Cork, and there's debate regarding his exact birth year, with possibilities ranging between 1728 and 1730. Burke's father, Richard Burke, was a successful lawyer at the Court of Exchequer in Dublin, firmly establishing the family as part of the upper-middle-class gentry. The Burkes trace their lineage back to the Burkes of Connaught, a family rooted in Irish history since the Anglo-Norman de Burghs conquered the region in the medieval era. This marked Edmund as a member of a family with a notable legacy in Ireland for over 500 years. Edmund's mother, Mary Nagle, came from a well-regarded Catholic family in County Cork. In contrast, Richard Burke was a Protestant, which reflected the religious divide in Ireland at the time. The couple's family life was marked by tragedy as they endured the loss of several children, though Edmund did grow up alongside surviving siblings, his sister Juliana and brothers Richard and Garrett. Edmund spent his childhood oscillating between his mother's Nagle family in Cork and his father's home on Erin Quay in Dublin, a routine dictated by the legal calendar in Dublin, where his father worked. Despite his mother's Catholic background, Edmund Burke embraced Protestantism, following his father's lead, a decision that was likely practical given the socio-political context of Ireland. Religion at that time was a powerful determinant of one's future, especially in terms of social standing and opportunity. Burke's early education began with tutoring in Latin and other subjects by an Irish teacher named O'Halloran in Cork. As he grew older, his formal schooling took him to Ballator in County Kildare, where in 1741 at the age of 11, he studied under the respected educator Abraham Shackleton. 3 years later, at the remarkable age of 14, Burke entered Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland's sole university at the time. Burke grew up in a land of stark contrasts. By the 18th century, Ireland had been deeply transformed by a series of wars in the 16th and 17th centuries that resulted in the near-total collapse of Irish Catholic landowners. The land confiscations and plantations that followed transferred vast tracts of land to a small, elite class of Protestant settlers, who comprised only 10 to 15% of the population. These Protestant landowners dominated Irish society, while the majority Catholic population remained economically marginalized. Burke's family straddled these divides. Though Protestant, they had deep Gaelic roots, and many of his relatives were Catholic. This dual identity, Anglo-Irish and Protestant, yet deeply aware of the Catholic plight, would deeply inform Burke's thinking and his ability to appreciate multiple perspectives in political discourse. Though most of his career unfolded in England, Burke remained connected to Ireland, often engaging with Irish political affairs. His enrollment at Trinity College in 1744 disproves later accusations from his detractors that he was secretly a Catholic, as the university did not permit Catholics to attend during that time. Burke excelled at Trinity, becoming a scholar in 1746 and earning his degree in 1748. Burke's upbringing and education in both Catholic and Protestant environments played a significant role in his future as a political thinker, giving him a unique ability to empathize with both sides of religious and political conflicts. His association with the famed educator Abraham Shackleton also shaped his later admiration for reason and moral philosophy, principles that would define his political career. At Trinity College, Edmund Burke was a capable, though not outstanding, student. Like many intellectuals who would later achieve greatness, he struggled within the confines of structured learning. However, he thrived outside the classroom, engaging actively in extracurricular activities. He became well known for his involvement in college debating societies and began writing on topics related to history and politics. In his final year, Burke contributed to The Reformer, a newspaper that reflected his growing interest in political and historical thought. He also developed a passion for literature and poetry, hinting at his broad range of intellectual pursuits. At this stage in his life, Burke appeared to be exploring multiple career paths, unsure whether to fully devote himself to philosophy, politics, history, or literature. Even after leaving Trinity, Burke's career direction remained uncertain. He spent a year writing for various Dublin publications before eventually yielding to his father's pressure to pursue a legal career. In 1750, Burke left Ireland for London to study law at the Middle Temple, one of the prestigious Inns of Court that served as training grounds for future lawyers in England. However, Burke soon discovered that the legal profession did not suit him. Despite his father's financial support during his time at the Middle Temple, Burke's interest in law waned. Instead of attending to his legal studies, he spent much of his time away from London, engaging in various intellectual projects. One such project was an account of the European settlements in America, a historical work co-authored with his cousin William, or Will Burke. The text explored the history of European colonization in the Americas, focusing on the Spanish, English, and French. It was written against the backdrop of the ongoing French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, in North America. By the time the book was completed, Burke had decided to abandon his legal studies altogether. In 1755, he informed his father that he would not pursue a career in law, choosing instead to dedicate his life to writing on historical, philosophical, and political subjects. As Burke's writing career took shape, his focus began to shift from history to broader philosophical and political debates. To fully appreciate Burke's intellectual environment, it's important to understand the wider context of the 18th century, a time defined by the Enlightenment. This intellectual movement built upon earlier developments in Europe, such as the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries and the scientific revolution of the 17th century. The Enlightenment also emerged in response to the religious upheavals of the 16th century, particularly the Reformation and the religious wars that followed, which caused widespread bloodshed across Europe. Enlightenment thinkers sought to move away from understanding society solely through religion and instead advocated for a more rational, scientific approach to governance, morality, and social organization. Many also questioned the political structures of their time, advocating for greater representation and the dismantling of old, class-based systems of power. In Europe, Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot were leading voices. In Britain, figures like John Locke, David Hume, and Adam Smith were at the forefront of these ideas. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin emerged as key contributors to Enlightenment thought. Even Ireland, Burke's homeland, produced notable Enlightenment scholars, including Jonathan Swift and George Berkeley. Burke himself was closely connected to many prominent figures, including the Anglo-Irish poet Oliver Goldsmith, who was a personal friend. Remarkably, Burke's literary career reached an early peak. Two of his most celebrated works were written in the mid-1750s, during this formative period of his life, setting the stage for his later influence as a political thinker and writer. Burke's decision to abandon his legal studies wasn't purely due to disinterest. He was also deeply engaged in debates about colonialism and the geopolitical struggles of his time, as evidenced by his work on an account of the European settlements in America. This early exploration of imperialism and settlement foreshadowed his later concerns about Britain's governance of its colonies, most notably seen in his opposition to the treatment of the American colonies and India later in his career. In 1756, Burke published A Vindication of Natural Society, or a view of the miseries and evils arising to mankind from every species of artificial society. This work was a satirical critique, though its subtlety led many readers to take it seriously, prompting Burke to add a clarifying preface in the second edition. In this text, Burke contrasts natural society with political society. He explores the state of nature versus organized government, examining the effects of modernity on human life. This topic, rooted in the earlier work of thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan, also dealt with religion, notably the concept of deism. Deism, popular in Enlightenment thought, sought to harmonize religious belief with scientific rationalism, rejecting traditional revelation in favor of empirical observation. Burke's approach in Vindication showcased his early intellectual engagement with both political and religious philosophies. The work also contained hints of early anarchistic thinking, though Burke later distanced himself from this interpretation. 1 year later, in 1757, Burke wrote what is often regarded as one of his most significant contributions to philosophy, a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful. For Burke, beauty was that which was aesthetically pleasing and harmonious, while the sublime was that which evoked awe, wonder, or even terror. A powerful concept that can evoke strong emotional reactions. The sublime, in Burke's view, was more intense and overwhelming than mere beauty. His ideas laid the groundwork for later philosophical and literary movements, particularly Romanticism, which delved into the emotional and spiritual depth of human experience. Burke's influence in this area reached beyond England, notably impacting Immanuel Kant's later work on aesthetics, and even tracing into the thought of Nietzsche. As Burke's reputation as a writer and thinker grew, he was increasingly in demand. In 1757, the publisher Robert Dodsley commissioned Burke to write a comprehensive history of England, which was to cover the period from the Roman invasion to the early 18th century. Although Burke made significant progress on the work, covering the period up to the Magna Carta in 1215, he eventually abandoned the project. Despite leaving it incomplete, the text was later published posthumously in 1812. This marked Burke's early foray into historical writing, a genre that would complement his philosophical and political works. In addition to his history project, Burke took on the role of editor for the Annual Register, a periodical that documented political, economic, and social events of the year. This work further solidified his standing as a significant intellectual figure in the 1750s and provided a steady source of income. His influence within the world of letters was also growing. In 1757, Burke married Jane Nugent, a member of a prominent Roman Catholic family in Dublin. Their marriage produced two sons, Richard and Christopher, born closely together in 1758. By 1759, Burke had made enough of a name for himself to secure a political appointment. He became the private secretary to William Gerard Hamilton, an up-and-coming member of the English Parliament who gained renown for his maiden speech at just 26 years old. Burke and Hamilton developed a strong working relationship, and when Hamilton was appointed Chief Secretary for Ireland in 1761, Burke returned to his homeland with him. During his time in Ireland, Burke used his influence to advocate for a reduction in the penal laws against Catholics. These laws severely restricted the rights of Catholics, and Burke, despite being Protestant, was appalled by their discriminatory nature, likely influenced by his own Catholic connections through his mother and wife. However, his efforts were largely unsuccessful, as anti-Catholic sentiment continued to grow in Ireland, particularly amidst increasing agrarian violence led by Catholic factions such as the White Boys, who targeted Protestant landholders in a campaign of rebellion. Burke's time as Hamilton's assistant was short-lived. When Hamilton was dismissed from his post in 1764, Burke left his position and returned to England. The two men had a falling out shortly afterward, leading Burke to seek new opportunities. This period of Burke's life, particularly his time in Ireland, served as a kind of political apprenticeship. His experiences, particularly his frustrations with the inefficacy of the political system and the social injustices he witnessed, would shape his later career. It was not long before a new opportunity arose. In 1765, Burke was hired as a secretary to Charles Watson Wentworth, the second Marquess of Rockingham, a senior figure within the Whig Party. The Whigs were the more liberal and progressive political faction in Britain, opposing the conservative Tories. This association with Rockingham would be the beginning of Burke's active involvement in British politics, a journey that would see him rise to prominence as one of the most important political thinkers of his time. In the summer of 1765, Rockingham became Prime Minister of Britain, and Burke was employed as one of his private secretaries. This opportunity proved to be Burke's political springboard. Soon after, Burke was offered a seat representing the constituency of Wendover, thus formally launching his career in British politics. Within a short time, Burke established himself as a highly skilled orator, a talent that would become a hallmark of his political persona. During an age when eloquence was a prized skill in Parliament, Burke quickly gained a reputation as one of the most accomplished speakers of his time. Over the next 17 years, he would solidify his position as a central figure in the group of MPs loyal to Rockingham, later known as the Rockingham Whigs. During his early years in Parliament, Burke's primary concern was Irish policy, an issue close to his heart as an Anglo-Irishman. Ireland at the time was a hotbed of agrarian violence, particularly in southern Ulster, where tensions between Catholic and Protestant landholders led to ongoing turmoil. Issues surrounding trade, such as customs on wool and soap, as well as the size of the army establishment in Ireland, were also pressing concerns. Burke positioned himself as an opponent of the policies of Viscount Townshend, the Viceroy of Ireland, between 1767 and 1772, advocating for more progressive and equitable governance of his homeland. Burke's ties to Ireland were also strengthened by his personal affairs. In 1766, after the death of his brother Garrett, Burke inherited a large estate in County Cork. This event required him to manage his financial and familial responsibilities, all the while maintaining his political career. During this period, he was honored by the city of Galway with the Freedom of the City, a recognition of his growing stature within the Anglo-Irish community. Meanwhile, Burke's political writings continued to influence public debate. Two of his most notable works during this period were Observations on a Late State of the Nation and Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents, published in 1769 and 1770, respectively. These treatises primarily addressed royal interference in the workings of Parliament. Since the 17th century, Britain had evolved into a constitutional monarchy, with Parliament playing the dominant role in governance and the Crown being more symbolic. However, with the ascension of George III to the throne in 1760, there were concerns that the monarchy was once again becoming overly involved in parliamentary matters. Burke's thoughts presented a liberal case for the reduction of royal interference in government, promoting the need for Parliament to operate more independently. However, this view gained little traction as Lord North, a staunch ally of King George III, became Prime Minister in 1770. The early 1770s were pivotal years for Burke as he established himself as a critical voice in opposition to the North administration. His rhetoric was aimed not just at domestic affairs, but also at the broader international scene. One of the significant issues during this period was the First Partition of Poland in 1772, an event in which Prussia, Russia, and Austria divided the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth among themselves. Burke condemned this as a violation of international justice and an infringement on the liberties of the Polish people. His stance reflected his broader worldview, one informed by his Anglo-Irish identity, where he was conscious of the duality of Ireland's place as both a part of the British state and a colony under British rule. By 1774, Burke was presented with the opportunity to contest a seat representing Bristol, one of Britain's largest cities at the time. Though soon to be overshadowed by the emerging industrial centers of Manchester and Newcastle, Bristol was still a major commercial hub in the mid-18th century. Burke successfully won the election and marked his victory with a famous speech to his constituents, in which he articulated his view of the role of a member of Parliament. He declared, Parliament is not a congress of ambassadors from different and hostile interests, which interests each must maintain as an agent and advocate against other agents and advocates. But Parliament is a deliberative assembly of one nation, with one interest, that of the whole, where not local purposes, not local prejudices ought to guide, but the general good, resulting from the general reason of the whole. You choose a member indeed, but when you have chosen him, he is not a member of Bristol, but he is a member of Parliament. This declaration was significant, as it outlined Burke's commitment to acting in the national interest rather than serving only the narrow, local concerns of his constituency. His stance was soon tested when he championed free trade between Britain and Ireland, a policy that was widely unpopular among the merchants of Bristol who feared it would harm their commercial interests. Nevertheless, Burke stood firm in his principles, continuing to represent Bristol throughout the 1770s, even at the risk of alienating his local supporters. Burke's eloquence, his philosophical depth, and his principled stances made him a unique figure in British politics. His approach to governance, particularly his belief in the supremacy of Parliament over the monarchy and his insistence on representing the national good, laid the groundwork for his later contributions to British political thought and policy. This era, however, was just the beginning of his long and influential career as a statesman, writer, and philosopher. As the 1770s unfolded, Edmund Burke's role in British political life would become even more prominent due to the rapidly escalating tensions between Britain and its American colonies. Although Burke had already established himself as a key figure in parliamentary politics, the unfolding events across the Atlantic would bring his convictions and eloquence to the forefront of national discourse. Britain had begun colonizing the eastern seaboard of North America in the early 17th century. By the 1700s, a network of 13 colonies stretched from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south. These colonies became increasingly valuable to Britain, with their fertile lands producing cash crops such as cotton, tobacco, and other goods that fueled transatlantic trade. Boston, New York, and Philadelphia became bustling hubs of commerce, contributing significantly to the British economy. Seeking to capitalize on the colony's growing wealth, the British government began imposing new taxes. However, the colonists had no representation in the British Parliament, and tensions began to mount as they resisted these financial burdens. By the mid-1770s, these tensions had escalated into outright rebellion. Colonists, dissatisfied with British rule and taxation, formed their own Continental Congress in Philadelphia and ultimately declared their independence, creating the United States of America. While the British Crown sought to reassert control, the war effort was proving divisive back home. Many British parliamentarians believed the war was being mishandled, while others sympathized with the grievances of the colonists. Burke emerged as one of the most vocal critics of the government's handling of the American crisis. His views on the matter had been clear even before he became a member of Parliament for Bristol. In a famous speech delivered prior to his election, Burke had condemned the excessive taxation of the colonies. This speech was later published in January 1775 under the title On American Taxation. In it, Burke argued that North's government had overstepped by imposing heavy taxes on the American colonies, and he predicted that if the administration continued down this path, war was inevitable. His words proved prophetic as the colonies would soon erupt in armed rebellion. In March 1775, as the prospect of war became increasingly likely, but before all hope of a negotiated peace was lost, Burke delivered another impassioned speech before the House of Commons. In this address, Burke called for reconciliation between Britain and its colonies, urging the government to adopt a more conciliatory approach to resolve the crisis. His speech laid out 6 distinct measures that he believed could bring both sides back from the brink of war. Foremost among these measures was Burke's call for the colonies to be given political representation. He argued that the colonists' demand for no taxation without representation was a valid grievance that could not be dismissed. If the British government continued to ignore their claim, tensions would only worsen. Burke believed that without political representation, the colonists would never see their situation as just, and it would be impossible to restore peace. This was a bold stance to take at the time, as many in Parliament were still hopeful of maintaining the traditional imperial relationship between Britain and its colonies without granting such concessions. Burke's speech on reconciliation stands out as one of his finest moments in Parliament. His eloquence and reasoned arguments reflected his deep understanding of political philosophy and human nature. He recognized that the American colonies were not merely rebelling out of selfish motives, but were responding to what they perceived as legitimate injustices. For Burke, a solution rooted in fairness and respect for the colonies' autonomy was the only path forward. Unfortunately for Burke and those who shared his views, the British government did not heed his advice. The war escalated, and in 1776, the American colonies officially declared their independence. Burke's opposition to the war placed him firmly at odds with Lord North's government and with King George III, both of whom were determined to crush the rebellion. Yet despite being in the minority, Burke remained steadfast in his principles, continuing to advocate for a more liberal and humane approach to governance. His stance on the American conflict would later be vindicated, but at the time, it was a politically risky position to take. Burke's views on the American Revolution were shaped not only by his philosophical beliefs, but also by his understanding of British imperialism and its limits. He understood that the colonies had evolved into a distinct society with its own interests and political culture, and that trying to impose direct rule from London without offering the colonists a say in their governance was a recipe for disaster. Moreover, his own Irish background may have given him a unique perspective on colonial resistance, as Ireland had long chafed under British rule. In the years that followed, Burke would continue to engage with the American question, but his legacy as one of the few parliamentarians who sought reconciliation rather than domination would endure. His speeches on the American Revolution demonstrated his ability to apply his political philosophy to real-world events, blending pragmatism with principle in his efforts to avert a war that he believed would bring more harm than good to Britain. This period of Burke's life marked a turning point in his career, cementing his reputation as a politician of deep conviction and foresight. His opposition to the war in America was not only a reflection of his empathy for the colonists' plight, but also a testament to his broader vision for a more just and an equitable British Empire, one that respected the rights and aspirations of its subjects, whether in England, Ireland, or the distant colonies of North America. As tensions between Britain and its American colonies escalated, Edmund Burke became one of the few voices advocating for a conciliatory approach, emphasizing the need for reform and fair treatment of the colonists. He argued that the British Crown and Lord North's government needed to acknowledge their mistakes in how they had handled the colonies. Burke proposed several key measures to address the crisis and bring about peace. These included the establishment of an efficient system for nominating colonial delegates and providing aid to the colonies when necessary. Most importantly, he urged the creation of a General Assembly in North America that would oversee taxation. Additionally, Burke advocated for ensuring that any taxes levied on the colonies would not be unduly burdensome. In essence, Burke's call was to treat the American colonists as subjects of the Crown, with the same rights and privileges as Englishmen. He believed that the colonies should not be seen merely as a source of revenue for the British Empire, but as a legitimate part of the nation that deserved fair representation and consideration. Burke's ideas were grounded in a philosophy of governance that valued justice, empathy, and the responsible exercise of power. Unfortunately, Burke's progressive ideas fell on deaf ears. The British government continued to pursue a hardline approach, ignoring opportunities for reconciliation. When the Continental Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition to London in the summer of 1775, a final appeal for the Crown to address their grievances and avoid war, it was rejected outright. This disregard for peaceful negotiations further alienated the American colonists, leading to their formal adoption of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia the following year. By the late 1770s, the war had turned in favor of the American colonists. Burke, along with many other Whigs, had come to openly support the idea of American independence. They argued that Lord North's government had not only lost the moral argument by refusing to treat the colonies fairly, but was also losing the military struggle. Despite being outmatched initially, the colonists had managed to organize a capable and professional army under the leadership of George Washington. Moreover, the American cause received a significant boost when they secured alliances with France and Spain, turning the tide of the conflict against Britain. These international alliances gave the colonists the upper hand in key battles, and it became increasingly clear that the British forces in North America would not prevail. During this turbulent period, Britain was also experiencing domestic unrest. The Gordon riots erupted in London, lasting over a week in 1780. These violent protests were driven by opposition to proposed reforms that would repeal anti-Catholic legislation. Hundreds were killed or injured in the wave of riots, which shocked the nation and further exposed the growing divisions within British society. For Burke, these events solidified his belief in the need for what would later be termed liberal conservatism. Burke was deeply committed to Enlightenment ideals and the pursuit of progress, but he believed that reform should be gradual and rooted in traditional values. He saw the dangers of rapid, revolutionary change and argued that meaningful progress could only be achieved through measured, incremental reforms rather than violent upheaval. Burke's commitment to national interests and reasoned reform often placed him at odds with his constituents in Bristol. His dedication to representing the interests of the entire nation, rather than focusing solely on the immediate concerns of his constituents, ultimately cost him his seat as an MP for Bristol in 1780. Nevertheless, he continued his parliamentary career, representing Malton for the remainder of his time in office. In late 1781, news reached England of a decisive defeat for British forces in North America. Lord Cornwallis, the commander of the last major British army in the colonies, had been surrounded and forced to surrender at the Siege of Yorktown in Virginia. The combined forces of the American colonials and their French allies had successfully outmaneuvered the British, delivering a crushing blow to the Crown's efforts to retain control of the colonies. With the defeat at Yorktown, the American Revolutionary War was effectively over, and Britain was forced to acknowledge that the colonies were lost. The end of the war also marked the end of Lord North's tenure as Prime Minister. After 12 years in office, North was replaced in the spring of 1782 by Lord Rockingham, a fellow Whig and one of Burke's closest political allies. Rockingham's appointment signaled a shift in British policy, as the government now sought to negotiate peace with the newly independent United States. Burke's steadfast opposition to North's policies during the war was vindicated, and he was brought into government as part of Rockingham's administration. Burke was appointed Paymaster of the Armed Forces, a prestigious position that granted him significant responsibility over military finances. He was also made a Privy Councillor, though he did not secure a seat in Rockingham's cabinet. Despite not being part of the inner circle of Rockingham's government, Burke's influence on British politics remained strong. His views on the American Revolution, imperial governance, and the need for responsible reform continued to shape public discourse. Burke's appointment to high office in the aftermath of the war was a recognition of his principled stand during one of the most tumultuous periods in British history. It was a testament to his unwavering belief in justice, equity, and the need for a more humane and enlightened approach to governing both at home and abroad. In the short period during which Edmund Burke held office after his appointment as paymaster of the forces, he was able to enact significant reforms, particularly through the Paymaster General Act of 1782. This legislation aimed to reform how government departments managed and allocated funds, ensuring more efficient and accountable use of public money. Additionally, in just a few months, Burke succeeded in abolishing over 130 redundant offices within the civil administration and the royal establishment. These positions were largely viewed as outdated sinecures that served no practical function in a modernizing government. These reforms saved the British government over £70,000 annually, a substantial sum at the time. However, Burke's reform efforts were abruptly halted when Lord Rockingham, the Prime Minister and his close political ally, died unexpectedly in July 1782 at the age of 52, after only a few months in office. With Rockingham's passing, Burke found himself back in opposition as the Earl of Shelburne took over as Prime Minister. This transition seemed to signal the end of Burke's role as paymaster of the forces. Yet, Shelburne's tenure as Prime Minister was also short-lived, and when a new coalition government formed in early 1783, Burke was asked to resume his role as paymaster. In this capacity, he played a key part in overseeing the demobilization of British forces and the payment of military pensions as the American Revolutionary War came to a close with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. This treaty marked Britain's formal recognition of the independence of the United States. Burke's tenure as paymaster ended in December 1783, and it would be the last time he held a significant political office, although he continued to serve in Parliament. Despite stepping away from high office, Burke remained influential. He was honored with several appointments during the 1780s, including being made rector of the University of Glasgow for several years. During a visit to his native Ireland in 1786, he became one of the founding members of the Royal Irish Academy, a prestigious institution established by royal charter that year. This visit was also the last time Burke would ever set foot in Ireland. The 1780s also marked Burke's increasing involvement in the abolitionist movement. As the slave trade had become enormously profitable for Britain during the 18th century, opposition to it, though consistent, had been relatively marginal for much of its existence. However, by the 1780s, a growing abolitionist movement began to gain traction in British society and Parliament, with figures such as the Quakers and other social reformers advocating for the end of the inhumane practice. Burke, despite representing the port city of Bristol, which had greatly benefited from the profits of the slave trade, emerged as one of the most vocal opponents of slavery. In 1788, when a motion for the abolition of the slave trade was brought before Parliament, Burke spoke forcefully against the institution, calling it, in his words, directly contrary to the interests of humanity. He condemned slavery as improper, degrading, and ruinous to the feelings and capacities of human nature. For Burke, the institution was a profound violation of human dignity and could not be justified under any circumstances. He also firmly believed that there should be no consultation with the slave plantation owners of the West Indies regarding abolition, as he saw no point in engaging with individuals whose economic interests were fundamentally tied to the continuation of slavery. Burke's abolitionist stance brought him into alignment with prominent figures like William Wilberforce, who was leading the parliamentary efforts to end the slave trade. In 1791, Burke supported and voted in favor of a bill brought forward by Wilberforce for the abolition of the slave trade. Although this bill was soundly defeated, Burke's unwavering commitment to abolition further demonstrated his dedication to Enlightenment principles and human rights, even when such positions were politically unpopular. Through his legislative reforms, his support for the abolitionist cause, and his continuing influence in political and intellectual circles, Burke's work in the 1780s exemplified his profound commitment to justice, equity, and responsible governance. His views on slavery, in particular, underscored his broader belief in the rights of individuals and his consistent advocacy for moral integrity in both domestic and imperial affairs. With the end of the American Revolutionary War in 1783, Edmund Burke's focus shifted to another colonial matter that would come to dominate his attention: India. England had a long-standing presence on the Indian subcontinent, having secured trade agreements and small coastal colonies as early as the mid-17th century. However, by the mid-1750s, England's presence in India had transformed dramatically. Figures like Sir Robert Clive, an officer of the English East India Company, led military campaigns that achieved remarkable victories over local rulers, particularly in Bengal and the northeast. These military successes sparked decades of rapid territorial expansion for the company, pushing further west toward Delhi. By the late 18th century, the English East India Company had evolved into the most successful and powerful corporation in human history. It was more than just a business. It effectively governed vast regions of India, overseeing the lives of tens of millions of people. The sheer scale of its influence offered extraordinary opportunities for wealth, especially among company agents, and it was this potential for corruption that increasingly caught Burke's attention. Burke's pursuit of the English East India Company in the 1780s was not merely a matter of public duty. It also carried an element of personal vindication. In the 1760s, Burke's brother Richard, along with their cousin and close friend Will Burke, had invested heavily in the company's shares. At that time, the company had just achieved its landmark victory at the Battle of Plassey and was in the midst of a meteoric rise, expanding rapidly and fueling intense interest in its shares, much like modern investment frenzies around companies like Apple, Tesla, or Nvidia. Caught up in this speculative bubble, Burke himself invested a significant portion of his own money in the company. However, by 1769, the speculative boom collapsed in what came to be known as the Bengal bubble, and this was quickly followed by the British credit crisis of 1772, one of the earliest examples of a modern financial meltdown. Burke and his family lost substantial sums, leaving him in debt for the remainder of his life. The memory of this financial disaster shaped his later actions and left him with a deep resentment toward the company. Burke's campaign against the English East India Company in the 1780s would soon focus on one individual in particular, Sir Warren Hastings, the Governor-General of Bengal from 1772 to 1785. Hastings, along with Clive, was one of the key figures in the company's conquest and administration of India. While Hastings was undoubtedly involved in some corrupt practices, by the standards of the time, corruption was an accepted reality in political and colonial offices. Burke's issue with Hastings was not just about corruption in general, but about the degree to which Hastings had profited from his position. Interestingly, Hastings was a complex figure, making him a somewhat unique target for Burke's ire. Unlike Clive, who approached India with an aggressive and exploitative mindset, Hastings had a genuine interest in Indian culture. He wrote extensively about the country and even sponsored the first English translation of the Bhagavad Gita, one of the foundational texts of Hindu philosophy. Hastings' appreciation of Indian culture was unusual for a colonial administrator of his time, setting him apart from many of his peers who viewed India solely through the lens of economic exploitation. Nevertheless, this did not shield him from Burke's relentless pursuit of justice. In 1785, Burke launched what would become his most famous campaign, the impeachment of Warren Hastings. As the principal architect behind this move, Burke accused Hastings of various acts of mismanagement and misconduct, particularly in how he had handled his authority in India. This case became one of the most significant and protracted legal battles of the era, lasting several years and capturing public attention throughout Britain. For Burke, it was not merely a personal crusade, but part of his broader fight against the corruption he saw threatening the moral and political integrity of the British Empire. Burke's interest in Indian affairs during this period reflected his overarching concern for justice, governance, and the limits of power. His efforts to hold the East India Company accountable and root out corruption were driven by both personal experience and his political philosophy, which placed a strong emphasis on the responsibilities of power. Although Hastings would ultimately be acquitted, Burke's impeachment campaign would go down in history as one of his most passionate and principled stands. It showcased his belief that even the most powerful entities, whether corporations or individuals, should be held accountable to the highest standards of justice and morality. Despite any redeeming qualities Warren Hastings might have had, they did not sway Edmund Burke. While other political figures had previously attempted to bring charges against Hastings, he was ultimately recalled from Bengal in 1785 under a cloud of suspicion. Surprisingly, upon his return to London, Hastings was welcomed warmly. Yet, this favorable reception did not deter Burke, who made it clear he intended to hold Hastings accountable. In Parliament, he referred to him cryptically as a gentleman just returned from India. Burke began his formal efforts against Hastings early in 1786, but it took over a year and a half before Hastings was officially arrested and charged. The trial itself began in February 1788, and Burke took the stage to deliver a blistering opening speech that spanned 4 days. His accusations primarily revolved around Hastings' personal self-enrichment and his political actions, which Burke believed had endangered Britain's crucial national interests in India by damaging relations with the native populations. Initially, the trial captivated public attention. Westminster Hall was filled with spectators eager to witness the proceedings. However, as time passed, the public's interest waned. The trial was repeatedly adjourned for long stretches, sometimes because Hastings requested time to prepare his defense, other times because the British government's attention had shifted to pressing events in Europe, especially with the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. In the end, Hastings' trial dragged on for almost 7 years before reaching a conclusion in 1795. The verdict saw Hastings acquitted of all charges, though the long ordeal had cost him heavily, both financially and in terms of reputation. Despite the acquittal, Burke remained convinced of Hastings' guilt, and to some degree, the trial is now seen as one of Burke's more contentious efforts. While Burke's moral integrity was unquestionable, it is difficult to ignore the possibility that his long-standing financial loss in the Bengal bubble of 1769 might have contributed to his dogged pursuit of Hastings. Nevertheless, even as the Hastings trial unfolded, Burke's political career took a sharp turn with the dawn of a new crisis, this time in France. In 1789, King Louis XVI of France convened the Estates General at his palace in Versailles, the first time a French parliament had been assembled in 175 years. This was a desperate measure taken due to the dire financial straits in which the French state found itself. However, events quickly spiraled out of control. By the summer of 1789, the delegates of the Estates General had begun to seize power from the crown, and soon a full-blown revolution was underway. The French Revolution intensified throughout the early 1790s. In time, it led to the trial and execution of King Louis XVI and the establishment of a French Republic. As these events unfolded, a coalition of European powers, including Britain, Austria, and Prussia, banded together in opposition to the French Revolution. In 1792, these nations went to war with revolutionary France, initiating a series of conflicts that would keep Britain at war with France for nearly a quarter of a century. It was in response to these revolutionary developments that Burke penned one of his most famous works, Reflections on the Revolution in France. This pamphlet, published in late 1790, offered a scathing critique of the revolution. Burke contrasted the French revolutionaries' ideology with the conservatism of the British Constitution, which he believed was a superior system due to its mix of liberal and conservative values and its careful balance of powers among Parliament, the Crown, the House of Lords, and the courts. This system, Burke argued, had evolved over centuries and was far more stable than the ideological extremism of the French revolutionaries. Burke's central contention was that the French Revolution was being driven by abstract and universal ideas about rights, ideas that were untethered to the practical realities of governance. In one famous passage, Burke quipped that it was pointless to proclaim universal rights to food, medicine, and other necessities if the state lacked the capacity to actually provide these things. In contrast, Burke praised Britain's system of government, which had developed practical institutions and measures over time to ensure stability and order. Perhaps most notably, Burke predicted that the chaos and extremism unleashed by the French Revolution would lead to the rise of a strongman, a military figure who would ultimately seize power and impose order. Though Burke's ideas were controversial, and he lost support among some Whig factions for his stance on the revolution, his predictions proved remarkably accurate. The revolution did indeed descend into bloodshed and disorder during the Reign of Terror in 1793, and in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte emerged as the military dictator of France, exactly as Burke had foreseen. In retrospect, reflections on the revolution in France solidified Burke's place as one of the most insightful critics of the revolutionary era. His emphasis on tradition, order, and pragmatic governance as safeguards against the excesses of revolutionary zeal would go on to influence conservative thought for generations to come. Reflections on the Revolution in France is now regarded as one of the most significant contributions to political thought, often hailed as a classic work of political science. It encapsulates much of Edmund Burke's thinking and is particularly crucial for understanding his role in the development of liberal conservatism. This ideology merges conservative principles with the pursuit of liberal policies, suggesting that while freedom and equality of opportunity in social and economic spheres are desirable, they must be balanced with respect for the rule of law and the preservation of societal cohesion. In the Reflections, Burke advocated for a conservative approach to political change. He opposed the abstract theorizing that characterized the French Revolution, arguing instead for incremental reform grounded in tradition. His brand of liberal conservatism would later influence economic thought, particularly the advocacy for free trade, which Burke championed at a time when protectionism was still the dominant economic policy across much of Europe. Burke's ideas on liberal conservatism were foundational during the Enlightenment, alongside thinkers like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and Edward Gibbon. Later utilitarian philosophers, including Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, would also contribute to these ideas. However, Burke stands out, particularly in comparison to the French political scientist Alexis de Tocqueville, for his eloquent defense of a balanced approach to change and the dangers of radicalism. Today, liberal conservatism is a core ideology for many center-right political parties around the world, marking Burke's lasting significance as a historical figure. The publication of the Reflections had an immediate impact on Burke's political career, straining his relationship with the Whig Party. Many Whigs, having supported the American Revolution, viewed the French Revolution in the same light, as a justified rebellion against tyranny. Burke, however, saw the French Revolution as fundamentally different and much more dangerous. His position clashed with that of many of his colleagues, leading to heated parliamentary debates in May 1791. One of the most dramatic moments of these debates came when Burke had a prolonged argument with his close friend Charles James Fox, a prominent Whig and former Foreign Secretary. Fox, who had been a staunch supporter of both the American and French revolutions, accused Burke of betraying the ideological stance he had taken during the American Revolution. Burke, in response, maintained that the French revolutionaries' ideology was the antithesis of both the British and American constitutions. The debate reached a personal breaking point when Fox expressed his hope that their disagreement wouldn't damage their friendship. Burke, however, delivered a cutting reply. "I regret that there is This moment signaled Burke's break with the mainstream Whigs, as he increasingly found himself isolated within the party. That summer, he published an appeal from the new to the old Whigs, in which he reiterated his arguments against the French Revolution and attempted to rally support from the more conservative members of the Whig Party, who he believed constituted a silent majority. However, Burke miscalculated the level of public support for his views, and while some privately agreed with him, they were reluctant to do so openly. As a result, Burke became an increasingly marginalized figure in Parliament. Despite his political isolation, Burke's opposition to the French Revolution continued to shape the political discourse of the time. Fox, who had drawn parallels between the storming of the Bastille in 1789 and the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in Britain, remained a symbol of the pro-revolutionary stance within the Whigs. Yet Burke still found a role in shaping the response to the growing revolutionary crisis. His warnings about the dangers of radicalism and ideological extremism resonated with many in Britain, particularly as the French Revolution spiraled into violence and terror in the early 1790s. As the French Revolution continued to unfold, Burke's predictions seemed increasingly prescient, and his role as a critic of radical change became central to his historical legacy. As war erupted between France and several European states, including Britain, the British government required widespread support at home for a policy of war, especially given the financial and social sacrifices this would entail. Edmund Burke, ever the patriot, was quick to urge moderates to support the government under Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, the leader of the Tory party. Burke's goal was to present a united front that could marshal the full resources of the nation and win the war against revolutionary France. However, this stance put him at odds with Charles James Fox and the pro-revolutionary Whigs, who were sympathetic to the revolutionary cause in France. In contrast, Burke found greater support among the Portland Whigs, a faction led by the Duke of Portland, who broadly shared his anti-revolutionary stance. These Whigs eventually lent their support to Pitt's government. Burke's efforts to foster cross-party cooperation during wartime were significant. He helped pave the way for a multi-party system, breaking away from the traditional two-party system that had long characterized British politics, which pitted the Whigs against the Tories. This split within the Whigs, with those who opposed the French Revolution diverging from those who supported its principles, was emblematic of the new political landscape of the 1790s, and Burke played a prominent role in its development. Despite his preoccupation with the war against France, Burke never fully lost sight of his Irish roots. In 1789, a Catholic committee was established in Ireland to lobby on behalf of the Catholic majority, seeking greater political and economic rights. By 1790, the committee had approached Burke, knowing he would be sympathetic to their cause, and requested that his son, Richard Burke, be appointed as their agent to lobby the British government for the repeal of the anti-Catholic penal laws. Burke supported this proposal, throwing himself into the cause of Catholic emancipation in Ireland. In 1792, he published a work titled Letter to Sir Hercules Languish, ostensibly addressed to a fellow member of Parliament but intended for a wider audience. In it, Burke laid out a compelling argument in favor of Catholic emancipation, critiquing the Protestant ascendancy that had long dominated Ireland. However, his efforts ultimately failed to produce immediate change, and although Burke did not live to see it, a rebellion in Ireland in 1798, with French revolutionary support, eventually convinced the British Crown that Ireland's legislative independence had to be abolished. This led to the passage of the Acts of Union in 1800, which dissolved the Dublin Parliament and formally incorporated Ireland into the United Kingdom. Burke's vision of Catholic relief would not be fully realized until over a century later, following Ireland's War of Independence. While Burke's efforts in Ireland met with frustration, his hopes for a coalition between the anti-French Portland Whigs and Pitt's Tory government came to fruition in 1794. A coalition agreement was reached in January of that year. However, despite Burke's crucial role in fostering this political realignment, he was excluded from the negotiations to form the new administration. Both Pitt and Portland viewed Burke as too old and politically marginalized to be given a senior role. By this time, Burke was in his mid-60s and suffering from what was almost certainly advanced stomach cancer. He planned to retire and requested only a pension to relieve his debts and perhaps a peerage as recognition for his long service. While he did receive the pension, King George III, wary of Burke's past opposition to royal overreach, refused to grant him a noble title. In June 1794, Burke resigned his seat for Malton, marking his official retirement from politics. Unfortunately, this period of his life was marred by deep personal tragedy. His son, Richard Burke, who had recently taken his father's seat in Parliament, died suddenly just 2 weeks later. The loss devastated Burke, and though he initially sought distraction in his retirement, his restless nature soon saw him return to political activity in an unofficial capacity. One notable development during this period was his relationship with William Wentworth Fitzwilliam, the fourth Earl Fitzwilliam and nephew of Burke's old ally, Lord Rockingham. Fitzwilliam, who had been appointed Irish Viceroy in 1794, welcomed Burke's advice on Irish policy. Additionally, Burke devoted himself to writing Letters on a Regicide Peace, a treatise in which he argued that Britain needed to prepare for a prolonged war with France. Burke believed that Britain's economic strength would ultimately outlast France's larger population and natural resources, emphasizing the need for patience and endurance in the face of revolutionary fervor. Burke's retirement was thus filled with intellectual labor, and though his formal political career had come to an end, he continued to contribute to the debates of his time. He died on July 9, 1797, at his country retreat in Beaconsfield, succumbing to the stomach cancer that had afflicted him for several years. At 68 years old, Burke left behind a rich legacy as a statesman, political philosopher, and defender of moderation in an age of revolution. Edmund Burke's influence left a lasting mark on British political history and continues to resonate in modern times. His impact on the development of parliamentary party systems, particularly the rise of liberal conservatism, is significant. By the 19th century, Burke's vision helped shape a political landscape that became increasingly defined by parties and diverse political opinions. The era saw the emergence of a more developed party system, moving beyond the simpler Whig and Tory divide of Burke's time. By the 1840s, four distinct parties were competing for political influence: the Conservatives, the Whigs, the Irish Repeal Party, which sought to restore the Irish Parliament, and the Chartist Party. The Chartists were particularly notable as the first grassroots socialist movement in Britain, rallying against the poverty and squalor caused by the rapid industrialization of the country and calling for greater rights and reforms for workers. This shift toward a more nuanced and diverse political system continued throughout the 19th century. New parties emerged, often forming alliances with others based on shared ideologies or goals, while smaller independent groups within larger parties wielded influence on key issues. The political landscape became more fluid and responsive, with conscience and principles playing a larger role in party alignment. Burke's steadfast approach to his own beliefs, often standing alone on matters of great importance, paved the way for the creation of such a system. His commitment to his principles over party loyalty contributed to a more complex political order, where cross-party cooperation and ideological independence became central features of British politics. Despite this immense contribution, Burke is often overlooked in discussions of Enlightenment-era figures. His contemporaries, such as Voltaire, Rousseau, Swift, and Adam Smith, are far more familiar to many, their names often associated with the intellectual and literary achievements of the time. Burke, however, remains a somewhat forgotten figure, despite being one of the foremost political thinkers, debaters, and writers of his era. His work not only spanned political theory and philosophy, but also offered cultural criticism and historical analysis, much of which was focused on the major issues of his time, from the American Revolution to the French Revolution. His seminal work Reflections on the Revolution in France stands as a cornerstone of political thought, offering a sharp critique of the revolution and advocating for gradual change over violent upheaval. Yet beyond his writings, Burke distinguished himself by actively participating in public life, a rare accomplishment among intellectuals of his time. He didn't just theorize from a distance. He engaged directly with the political issues of his day, becoming a vital public figure in a critical period of British and European history. For these reasons, Edmund Burke should be regarded as more than just a political philosopher. He was a true public intellectual, someone who bridged the gap between theory and practice. His ideas laid the groundwork for modern conservative thought, and his belief in the importance of tradition, gradual change, and the preservation of social order continue to inform conservative philosophy today. So, what do you think? Was Edmund Burke one of the most underappreciated political figures and philosophers of the pre-modern era? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always, thank you for watching.